The work breakdown structure is my favorite project management tool. And in this video, I'm going to take you through the process of creating a work breakdown structure according to the project management body of knowledge. Okay, so what is a work breakdown structure? Well, work breakdown structure is a hierarchical decomposition of the project scope. In simple terms, it's a structured breakdown of all the project work. We take the entire project scope, we break it down into different levels, and then under each of these levels, component pieces. Each level we add to our work breakdown structure, we're going to get increasingly detailed. And the goal is to get to the lowest level of the work breakdown structure, which is a component work package. Why is the work breakdown structure so important? Well, ultimately, it's the foundation for our estimates, our schedules, quality management systems, our procurement. It's our way of understanding the project scope. There's no better way to understand the scope of a project than to break it down into its component pieces. Then we can clearly understand the exact scope of every individual item. And so if we make an effective work breakdown structure, we cover the entire project scope, we're not missing any items, we've properly understood and defined our project scope. Often, I think it's easier to understand these things by seeing them. So on the screen, I've got an example work breakdown structure. You can see at the top level, we've got our entire project scope, a new road project. Then at level 1, we've broken it down into 4 separate scopes. We've got our earthworks, we've got our structures, we've got our utilities, we've got our roadworks. Then we've got a level below that where each of these portions of the project scope, we then break down further. Now the goal here is as we go down each level in the work breakdown structure, we're increasingly adding detail. So under earthworks, we've got clearing and grading, bulk earthworks, drainage, and subgrade. So each of these is a more detailed activity than the level 1 item. Then we can even go a level below that. We can take our level 2 activity, so street lighting, which was under utilities. We can then break that down even more. So we've got our level 3 breakdown, which is our pits, conduits and foundations, lighting poles, distribution boards, and circuits and luminaires. Once we arrive to the lowest level of how we want to break the project scope down, we can then turn these into a list of work packages. So this is our work breakdown structure dictionary, where basically we identify every single work package of the project. For example, project pits, conduits and foundations in zone A, zone B, zone C, zone D. These form our work packages, and together, once we've broken down every component of the project scope, we've got to the lowest level. We've defined every single work packages. We put these together, we get our work breakdown structure dictionary. Now let's look at our PMBOK process for creating the work breakdown structure. So on the left-hand side, we've got our inputs. So the inputs is the project management plan, specifically the scope management plan, with our project documents, including the project scope statement, and then we've got our enterprise and organizational factors. We take all these, we use our tools and techniques to create the work breakdown structure, and our output is going to be the project management plan with any updates to the scope baseline. The work breakdown structure is going to form part of our scope baseline. And then as we go through the process, importantly, any assumptions or requirements we've changed, we need to update our project documents. So reiterating these inputs, we've got our project management plan, specifically our scope management plan, which defines our approach to managing and controlling scope on the project. And in our scope management plan, we should have in there how we're going to create our work breakdown structure and how we're going to use it. We then have our project documents, specifically our project scope statement. So in the previous process, we defined project scope, we created a scope statement. Work breakdown structure, we're pretty much taking that to the next level. We're going to break the project down into all its component pieces and work packages, and also our requirements documentation. So we should refer back to our requirements traceability matrix to make sure all of our requirements are included in our work breakdown structure. And then as always, we've got our enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. The tools and techniques we're going to use to actually create our work breakdown structure. So importantly, we've got expert judgment. So this is where we leverage and engage with other experts. Specifically, we want to find people who've delivered similar projects and understood exactly what's involved. One of the challenges specifically with construction projects is You have your product scope. You have the work that you're delivering. It'll be detailed on drawings, specifications. It's clearly to see. Where it becomes challenging, in my personal experience, is the delivery of the work. What isn't captured in the drawings, but what is the work that needs to be done to complete the project? And one of the best places to find this out is by people who've delivered similar projects. They understand the work involved, all of the different tasks, and that information is often going to come from experienced individuals who've completed similar projects. Then the primary technique we're going to be using to actually create a work breakdown structure is decomposition. So decomposition is just a technique to break the project down. We need to take the project scope and break it down into increasing levels of detail. Now, there's so many different ways we could do that. That's why we need to do it in the optimal way that makes the most sense for our project. So typical process we would follow to do this from the PMBOK is identifying and analyzing the deliverables. So what's the work we're actually completing? Then we'll structure and organize a WBS around this. There's a couple of different ways we can do this. We'll then basically start from the top, do our first level of the WBS, and just add increasing detail till we get down to the lowest level of the WBS. Now, the lowest level we decide is ultimately going to depend on the level of control we need. It will depend on the specifics of the project and how much detail we need to effectively manage the project. Now, if we're working on a major construction project, we might have 20 levels to our WBS. If we're working on a tiny capital works upgrade, it might only have 3 levels. And it just really depends on our project and what level of detail we need to get to effectively manage it. So that's always going to be some art to that process. And once we've got to the lowest level of our WBS, we'll then develop and assign codes, create our full work breakdown structure. And then we also want to verify and check that the breakdown we've done is appropriate for the need. So that's going to depend on what we're using it for. If we're using it for estimating, we're using it for scheduling, we're using it for quality. We just want to do some sort of sense check. The way we've broken the project scope down matches the needs of what we're going to be using it for. There's a couple of different approaches we could use to actually do this. So we could just do a first principles top-down approach. That's where we're not going off any sort of reference project, we're just doing it for the first time. We're using our intuition, expert judgment. There might be some organization or specific templates we could use. There might be examples from other projects. And so in those situations, our company might already have a typical WBS they want us to use for cost reporting, quality. It really depends on the organization you're working for and the resources they have. Importantly, there's a couple of different forms our WBS can take. So we could break the project down based on the phases. So we could have the first level of the WBS you could have on the initiation phase, the planning phase, the executing phase. If it's a construction project, you could have it broken down from design, pre-construction, construction, commissioning. You could do it based on the major deliverables. So the previous work breakdown structure that I showed, it was broken down based on earthwork, structures, street lighting. So that's more a deliverable structured breakdown as opposed to a breakdown around the project phases. And then you have to decide what level of detail you want to get to and which subcomponents you want to include. Again, it's like that saying, there's lots of ways to skin a cat. Often there's multiple right answers to the question. So again, it really comes back to, in my experience, understanding what you're going to be using the WBS for and making sure you're constantly considering the use of the WBS and referring to this as you do the breakdown. You want to come up with some breakdown that makes sense. Additionally, you also want to check it's comprehensive. So your WBS needs to cover 100% of the project scope. So another way to check is just to simply audit if all the scope is included and what's missing. And finally, you want to make sure the packages are mutually exclusive. You don't want to cover the same scope in multiple packages, or that'll have carry-on effects, which it impacts your estimates, it impacts your schedules, and yeah, you just want to make sure each of the package is mutually exclusive, but on the other hand, you're also not missing scope. Okay, as discussed, the core output of this is going to be the work breakdown structure and the work breakdown structure dictionary, which is going to form part of our scope baseline. So remember, the WBS, in addition to the scope statement, will form part of the project scope baseline that we're developing during the planning phase. So we're also going to produce our work breakdown structure dictionary, which is, again, a detailed list of all the deliverables, each component in the work breakdown structure, and some level of detail against each work package, like a description, like an activity reference code. Once we've created our work breakdown structure, we've finished creating our scope baseline. So as I've mentioned before, the scope baseline is one of the most important documents that we develop during the planning phase of the project. On one hand, it's going to make it much easier to actually validate and check we've completed all of the project work. But on the other hand, it's going to make it easy to avoid doing unnecessary costly work without any changes to the schedule or budget. So the scope baseline is one of the most important documents we can produce during the planning phase. It's going to include the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, the work packages and the work dictionary, and any planning packages. So a planning package is if during this planning pre-construction phase, we can't capture all the detail we need, we might have placeholder work packages. So that's all a planning package is. It's a placeholder for work that we're going to define later. Depending on the specifics of your project, you might choose to include different things in your work breakdown structure dictionary, but typical things we would want to include would be an account identifier. So this would be a code, whether it's a number, a series of letters, a description of the work, any assumptions and constraints around the work, a responsible organization. So if we're procuring certain items and we've outsourced the scope, we could put the company we're working with there, any schedule milestones, any associated schedule activities, the resources we're going to need, the budget, the quality activities, and the acceptance criteria. So ideally, we'd include all this stuff in our work breakdown structure. And if we can include all this stuff in our breakdown structure, it means we've created the WBS correctly and that our WBS intuitively aligns with our schedule, our estimate, and our quality requirements. One of the biggest mistakes, not necessarily a mistake, but just something that's really challenging to do on a project is to get the estimate, the schedule, and the quality to all align with a single WBS. There's a real art in doing so, but it's going to make controlling and managing your project during the execution phase much easier if you can get all three of them to align. And additionally, once we've created the WBS, through this process, we're always also very likely to need to update some of our other project documents. Through this process of creating the WBS, it's likely we've identified additional assumptions we want to include in our assumption log, and also any additional requirements we've picked up. Again, just projects are this series of processes moving through, and as we go through these processes, we're often picking up more information. It's ultimately an iterative process, so while we're going through and creating the WBS, it's very likely we're going to need to update our assumptions, and also we may have picked up additional requirements. Fundamentally, the WBS is my favorite project management tool because it enhances our understanding of the project scope, and if we set it up correctly, if we set it up to align with our estimate, our schedule, our quality, it makes understanding the project scope so much easier. So I highly recommend during the planning phase of your project, you're investing the time to properly set up your WBS. During the execution phase, it will make your life 1,000 times easier.